Good morning to you all. We are now into the final fortnight of our series on the attributes of God, entitled The Divine Attributes. And herein, these two last and final weeks before Advent, we are examining what is often referred to as the double-sided coin of God's mercy and his grace. As you can see above, mercy is what we are examining first, certainly not in isolation. There will be a lot of overlap between this week and next week, not just literarily, because we'll be exegeting the same passage, not only thematically, by virtue of them being so intricately related, but also indeed logically, rationally, and everything else. Herein, we are exegeting just one particular verse across the next 2 weeks, or really it's actually two by the time we get to the end of next week. Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, which is a particular focus. Obviously, we've just had the broader context of verses 1 through 10 read to us, examining where on earth we are in the Old Testament, what on earth is going on. This is indeed after Moses has had the encounter upon Mount Sinai. He's been given the law, the tablets, the first tablets, during which time, of course, as you may recall, the people of Israel freak out because Moses has been gone for all of 5 minutes, and they decide to melt down their various jewellery and worship a false idol of Egyptian deity. And so indeed now Moses has gone back up the mountain after having rightfully smashed the tablets, and now the tablets are being made over again, and it's herein we get the renewal of the covenant. Nevertheless, we get herein this first passage of Exodus 34 that we've had read to us this morning, these two seminal verses of verses 6 and 7, which serve as a fundamental axiom for understanding not just the mercy of God, not just the grace of God, but indeed actually a number of the attributes which we've been examining in this recent block of about 4 to 5 weeks now. By axiom, what I mean is an axiom being a statement that is true, that serves as a premise for further argumentation or discussion or theorization. And it's an axiom biblically that comes up quite often. Indeed, it comes up in a number of places. This is the first of which, this is the proverbial genesis of this biblical axiom that then comes up a number of times throughout the Old Testament. We've had one of them read to us from Psalm 86. For those who are taking notes, I will assist you into exactly where we find that. We find that in Numbers chapter 14, verse 18. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 17. Psalm 86, verse 15, which is what we had read to us earlier, as well as Psalm 103, verse 8. Psalm 145, verse 8. Joel chapter 2, verse 13, Jonah chapter 4, verse 2, and Nahum chapter 1, verse 3. If you didn't get all of that, you're more than welcome to come and ask me afterwards. But there's a number of places, as you can see, wherein we find this axiom, and of course we'll read out what that is concerning the nature of God, and it serves as a fundamental reality of Israelite piety going forward from this point from Exodus 34 throughout what comes later on in the Old Testament itself. I mentioned at the top that mercy and grace are often considered the double-sided coin. They are two sides of the one coin. They are expressions and outpourings and outflows. They are byproducts naturally of God's goodness. Not necessarily that they are not characteristics, they very much are, hence our covering. They are divine attributes in their own right. But they are, of course, harkening all the way back to the perfection of God, wherein we saw that God's character, his attributes, are not able to be partitioned into little categories in reality. We can only possibly examine them in such fashion, but we have constantly stressed that we are not to confuse that with the idea that God's character is able to be dissected in such fashion. It is all in one, it is perfect, it is totalizing, it is infinite, it is complete. And so that is why we have seen, going all the way back to week 1, so much overflow and so much overlap between the various attributes that we have been examining. In simple terms, and this will serve us well over this weekend, the following week, mercy and grace, in the simplest possible definitions, can be rightfully understood in inverse fashions. Namely, mercy is not getting what you deserve, Grace is getting what you do not deserve. I'll say that again. Mercy is not getting what you deserve. Grace is getting what you do not deserve. How that applies, how that actually works itself out in the world is what we will then see and examine over these coming 2 weeks. How we are to understand that proverbial double-sided coin of God's mercy and his grace. So as I mentioned, we are focusing on these 2 particular verses. So if you would look with me in chapter 34 of the book of Exodus. Verse 6, which is our particular focus this morning. Yahweh, the Lord, passed before him being Moses in this case, and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. This herein, and you'll notice a number of words here, we will dissect this and exegete each particular clause in this verse. The following verse, which we look at next week, verse 7, says, keeping in steadfast love for thousands, or you could also translate as to the 1000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. And that seemingly on the surface level contradictory statement, we will do good work on resolving that as very much not a contradiction, but in fact a blessed revelation. But verse 6 is what we are focusing on here this morning. So we see herein God described ontologically as a God merciful and gracious. Gracious, of course, next week, and so we'll save on that one. But the first of that clause, a God merciful. This is speaking to his being. Fortunately, that comes across quite well when we translate into English. This is speaking to the ontological nature of God. This is speaking to God in his being, as so many of the seminal passages and verses that we have explored and exegeted throughout this series do. A God merciful. That is to say, a God in his being merciful. A God who in his nature is merciful. That is why it reads as such. A God not necessarily who does merciful things, although that would be 100% true, and is in fact true. But notice that it's not in a verbal form. It does not say a God who does merciful acts towards people, even though there are plenty of places in Scripture where that is exactly the description given. This particular passage, this particular verse, this particular axiom is speaking to his nature. A God merciful. A God who is merciful is. That preposition and adverb is. A God who is, by his nature, mercy. Now, of course, this may seem, and as is often the case when we are considering the divine attributes of God, not just in isolation, but in totality, how does such mercy possibly square away with the fact that last week we saw that God is wrath, that he is vengeance, that he is, harkening back even further a couple of weeks prior, he is justice. And when we examine the righteousness of God, as is the case with all of his attributes, they cannot be understood logically to be in contradiction to one another. They are attributes of the one being, and indeed God is not a schizophrenic deity. He is not a God that somehow possesses multiple personalities. He indeed is but one. It is what the ancient Shema, the proverbial motto of the Old Covenant people says. Shema Yisrael Yahweh Eloheinu Yahweh Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is one. Yahweh is our God. Indeed, he is one. He is singular. So how then do we square mercy and a concept like mercy, which, as we explained, is not getting what you deserve, namely wrath, namely justice, namely divine vengeance, with something like wrath? This is where we come into a place of tension, admittedly, not unresolvedly, but admittedly. Because we as human beings, and this is something which we covered particularly earlier on in the series with a number of attributes that seem, inverted commas, to be contradictory in nature, we as human beings view often the divine through very human lens. We like to think of God just like us, where at one particular moment I'm doing this, and another particular moment I'm doing that. And that when I'm doing this, I can't by definition be doing that, and so on and so forth. But as we've covered a number of times throughout this series, particularly when we looked at the transcendence of God, the fact that God transcends all things. He is not confined to a specific locale. He is not limited by time and space. Indeed, then, we can understand that his actions, flowing forth from his divine nature and his attributes, is also transcendent. It surpasses the confines and the limitations of the material world of time and space. He is able to be both wrath and mercy and grace, all at the same time. He is not confined to this particular dimension that we are. When you think, for example, of executions of God's wrath in the world, say really overt examples, like God's annihilation of the Assyrian army in the Old Testament, wiping out over 100,000 warriors of Assyria in a single night. In the exact same instance in which he is executing justice upon the Assyrian army, he is also being merciful to the Israelite peoples by virtue of their mere existence, by virtue of the fact that even in the face of, by that point in history, their infinite list of sins and transgressions, they still existed. They were still breathing. They were not having justice brought down upon their heads. Two things occurring simultaneously at the same time. This is the power of the one who is, by definition, infinite and transcendent. And so when we understand the mercy of God as with all of his attributes, they are not confined to the same dimensional parameters that we are. This is how we are to understand and logically resolve from the scriptures what seem to be contradictions, but upon examination turn out not to be contradictions at all, but in fact are perfectly logically coherent when you understand the nature and attributes of God in totality, not with a myopic view in isolation. And so we are told that God is merciful. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, this is a constituent element of him being goodness, him being good as well as loving. There's been a natural sequence of the ordering of these sermons and these descriptions throughout this series, from the love of God through to the goodness of God, which we entitle the omnibenevolence, the all goodness of God, the righteousness of God, and then the wrath of God. Those have been the 4 weeks preceding this particular week. By virtue of the fact that God is love, that he is in his nature the definition of love, all that he does is therefore good. He is the embodiment of goodness. He is the one who we call omnibenevolent, all good willing, all good. By virtue of the fact that he is all good, he is therefore the standard of righteousness, i.e. justice. What he does, what he says, what he reveals is the standard of justice, not whatever humanity decides in that particular era. And therefore, by virtue of him being the standard of righteousness, which is modelled and flows forth from his character, by definition, any transgression of the law of God, which is predicated on the divine nature, brings wrath. To violate the law of God is indeed to violate the divine character by virtue of its nature. This is how these attributes flow together. This is how they all come together in the perfection of God's nature. It flows forth, in this case, his mercy from his love and from his goodness. And indeed, it is a communicable attribute, as are all these ones that we've been examining from week 7 onward. You can read and explore so many of the great instances of the mercy of God. The context of this very passage alone is in itself an act of mercy. Again, Moses has been given the law. In his absence, the people have freaked out. They have gone to Aaron and said, "Please make for us something far more comfortable, like the gods of old which we knew." And so indeed he does this, and they bow down and worship. Immediately, that should have ended any possible hope of covenantal relationship whatsoever. God would have been perfectly within his rights, would he not, to have cut it off before the proverbial plane even took off from the tarmac. But he doesn't. What does he do in the light and in the face of such treason, of such blasphemy, of such idolatry, of such rebellion? Well, we get these words. This is what comes in response. The covenant is renewed, and he declares to the people through his prophet and through his commander Moses these seminal and famous words, which serve, by virtue of the references that I listed earlier, as an important axiom throughout the covenantal history of God's people. That's why it comes up in so many different cross-references throughout the Old Testament. The very context in which these words are uttered is one of an extremely long list of demonstrations of God's mercy in the world, in pragmatic terms. There is, of course, no shortage of areas that we could turn to see this particular mercy. Indeed, the very nature of mercy is why we are then given the second clause in this particular verse, that God is slow to anger. You'll see there, our God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger. This is arguably more fascinating when considering the whole counsel of the divine nature than even the word merciful itself. That he is indeed slow to anger. Anger, of course, here inherently tied to the word wrath, right? And often those words are used at least synonymously, if not interchangeably, throughout the Old Testament. They are technically different words in the Hebrew, but those two words serve as synonyms. They are semantically tied to one another, if that makes sense. His anger is, I suppose, the proverbial powerhouse of his wrath. It is the steam that powers the engine, so to speak. And it is righteous anger. Again, we covered in passing and in brevity, but nevertheless covered last week, that his anger is a righteous anger. And indeed, anger is able to be had and to be held and to be expressed without sinning. The Apostle Paul mentions as much, and we cross-reference that particular passage, right, where he admonishes and warns and exhorts the New Testament Christians that in their anger make sure they do not sin. Logically, it presumes that you are able to be angry without sinning. Otherwise, that command from the Apostle Paul makes no logical sense. Indeed, we saw in that cross-reference that anger is the rightful response to sin. It is the rightful response against unrighteousness, against transgression, against unlawfulness, wickedness, evil, darkness, rebellion. This is the rightful response, hence the term righteous anger. There can be unrighteous anger. You can very much sin in your anger, make no mistake. But there does still exist at the core the very reality of righteous anger. Anger that is justified. And here, this is pointing towards the fact that God's response to transgression, response to the rebellion of his creatures, is anger. And rightfully so. He has given us life. He has given us breath. He has given us shelter. He has given us food. He has given us everything we know. And then for that soul to turn away from God, to rebel against its creator, the one who has given it everything it possibly knows and holds dear, warrants in response anger. especially when you consider that God is love. To have that love spurned, to have that love turned away from, to have that love crushed, to have that love ridiculed, laughed at, mocked, brings anger. And this is the response of God to such rebellion. But yet we're told here that he is slow to anger. Slow here. This is a statement of time. What does that mean? Well, what it tells us, logically speaking, is that we're actually able to measure that. We are actually, it presupposes here, able to see whether or not such anger, such wrath, is slow to build. Whether God withholds or keeps at bay, whether he stays his wrath, his anger. And indeed, we have seen that so famously throughout the Old Testament and the New, but particularly the Old. Was it not God who waited so patiently for over 400 years before he unleashed his justice upon Egypt for the enslavement of the Israelite people? Was it not the same God who patiently waited and endured 400 plus years of pagan tolerance and syncretism on the part of God's covenant people from the days of Solomon down throughout the centuries, finally to the Babylonian conquest? Did he not suffer so long? Did he not stay and hold and keep his anger at bay for over 4 centuries, while generation after generation after generation rebelled against him, disobeyed him, violated his commands, violated his covenants, ignored his demands, refused to upkeep and to uphold and to maintain their covenantal obligations? Did he not endure that for centuries? Until finally, after over 400 years, he then brings justice against the violators of the covenant. And even then, justice which had a promise attached to the tail end, a most gracious act, concept which again we'll cover next week. How can God not be described as infinitely merciful? How can he not be described as long-suffering, to use one of the ways we can translate certain Hebrew words into English? Indeed, is his love not long-standing and faithful, as is described just after this particular clause? Indeed, he is slow to anger. We see it over and over again in those kinds of specific examples, even on the more macroscopic level, on the general level. God suffered through, God forbore with, God endured thousands upon thousands of years of pagan rebellion. Thousands of years of rebellion on the part of the Egyptians, of the Assyrians, of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes, the Greeks, the Scythians, the Romans, the Mesoamericans, the Aboriginal Australians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Turkic tribes, the Bantu, people all over the world from every different culture, upon every continent on earth. Did he not endure thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years of blatant rebellion? Yes, he did. He did. What's incredible in the face of that is that even though it would be his right, he did not send the incarnate Son of God into the world to annihilate it there and then. Instead, he sent the Son of God into the world not to annihilate the old world, but to renew it, to restore it, to redeem the world. He did not forsake it, he did not obliterate it, he did not annihilate it out of existence. He sent the Son in the incarnation to redeem humanity, to redeem the world, not to obliterate it, which would have been his legal right. It would have been his right. Indeed, he executed his right in the great flood. When great wickedness had arisen upon the earth, he executed justice. He wiped out evil, he cleansed the world, literally and figuratively, in the great flood. So he had done something like this before, which was within his right. But yet this time he does not send the Son incarnate to destroy us, to obliterate or to annihilate the old world. Instead, as we are told, upon those who dwelt in darkness, it is upon them whom a great light has now shone, in fulfillment of the prophecies given in Isaiah. This is what the incarnation was. This is how we are so clearly able to see that the great mercy of God is exercised, as we are told, in the fact that he is slow to anger, that he puts up with infinitely more than he should have to, or that he has any obligation to. Not only should we recall, remember, and understand this on the individual level, because this applies to every single person in this room, it also applies corporately to families, to towns, to communities, to societies, to states, i.e. nations, to entire civilizations. At all levels of human life does this apply. The God merciful is indeed slow to anger, and that is not something that individually or corporately we should ever forget. That God is indeed slow to anger. And then as we continue, if you'll look there again, it says to us, continuing on through verse 6, that he is abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Now again, this particular clause, in the tail end here of verse 6, built around 3 Hebrew words, right, which makes it easy for us to exegete. Right? Ra'ab, chesed, and emeth. We'll examine what on earth those mean, because it'll enlighten for us what's being said here in this beautiful phraseology on the part of God, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Your translations might also say abounding in mercy and goodness, or goodness and mercy, either way. The number of other ways that could be translated, and again we'll get into that exegesis here. But rab, abounding, which is how most of your translations in English should probably read, means exceeding, to be greatly numerous, right? To be exceeding. It's speaking of an abundance. You could also actually translate that as abundantly. Minority reading could say greatly abundant, right? There is this wealth that's inherent to that kind of word rab, R-A-B, if you were to transliterate that into English. It speaks of exceedingly. He is abounding. He is full of what is then the object of this particular sentence, this particular clause, namely chesed and emeth, right? Steadfast love, goodness, etc., and faithfulness or mercy. It's not the specific word for mercy, but it can be translated mercy. It's kind of part of the semantic range, as we refer to it. It's a phrase that's come up many times. The semantic range means what are the different words in the language you're translating into, in our case English, that are encapsulated in the original word. Mercy is in and among that. It's not the most direct translation, but the concept of mercy is inherent to that word faithfulness, which is often translated as faithfulness. You can actually directly translate that also as truth, right? So some of you may have truth in your translation, right? Faithfulness and truth, completely synonymous in that word emeth, E-M-E-T-H in the English. This is a lot of words. What on earth does all this mean? Well, let's dissect it. He is abounding, he is full of, he is indeed exceeding in these two particular factors. Again, it harkens back to the infinite nature of God, that he has an abundance. The kind of imagery that's attached to it, and there's other words like this that are also use this imagery in the Hebrew, but it's a cup that overflows. That's why often we get that kind of phraseology or that image in the Old Testament of God in his particular actions or attributes, whatever's being discussed in that context, as being a cup that overflows with insert whatever's being discussed. This is the kind of imagery in the Hebrew thought that is encapsulated in a passage or in a clause like this. He is exceeding, he is abounding, he is greatly numerous in chesed and emeth, in steadfast love. This steadfast love, again, loving kindness is another way you might get this translated, right? Long suffering, love, also sometimes in some English translations. It speaks to a love that endures, right? Faithful love or steadfast love, enduring love. Love that endures through things which buffet against it, things which would otherwise stop it, things which would otherwise not warrant the love. Like, tick, 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 sin. Like evil, like wickedness, like rebellion, like darkness. Things which otherwise should have, would have, could have deserved justice. Things which should have, would have, could have deserved a retreat or a recension of the love of God, of the mercy of God, so on and so forth. But instead, his chesed, his faithful love, his enduring love, his steadfast love overcomes that which would otherwise thwart it. This is the important theological basis, by the way, through which we are to then understand why Christ is able to say things like, "Those whom the Father gives to me, I shall never cast out." Right? "Those who I hold in the palm of my hand shall never be taken from me." Taken from me by the forces of darkness. Why? Because indeed his love, his faithfulness, his mercy, his attributes are steadfast. They are enduring. They endure through any assault against said attribute. This is why he can say in his sovereignty with full and utter confidence as the God of truth that those, his elect, whom God has given to him, he shall never cast out, and he shall never lose them from his grip, if I were to paraphrase. He shall never lose them. Because he knows that his love, his mercy, his grace, which we'll cover next week, so on and so forth, it endures through any possible assault against it. This is why we understand it. This is the theological basis for understanding the words which then come, in this case, thousands of years later. It speaks, does it not, to the fundamental necessity of studying, exegeting, and understanding the whole counsel of God, the whole counsel of sacred scripture. For those in our Bible study, you've seen that graph of all the cross-references to the Old and New Testament, right? This essentially never-ending rainbow of texts which are cross-referenced, which are quoted, which are paraphrased, which are inferred, which are explored, which are expounded upon, so on and so forth. This is why you must study the scriptures in totality. Because indeed, we are to take the very God of those scriptures, likewise, in totality. And so he is abundant in chesed, in steadfast, faithful, enduring love, and also in that emeth, in that faithfulness and in truth, which again, intricately and intimately tied to that concept of enduring faithfulness and enduring love. Because he is the God who is sovereign, who is transcendent, who is omniscient, who declares the end from the beginning, and who from times past declares things not yet done, who is the one who is described as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the everlasting unto everlasting, is able to do so because he is abounding, he is exceeding in emet, in faithfulness, in truth. He is truth. And so this beautiful wording that we get, abounding in steadfast love, in chesed, in mercy, and in faithfulness or truth. This is why he is so long-suffering. Going back, this is why he is slow to anger. And when consulted and taken together, this is how we are to understand the very beginning of this axiom, that Yahweh is a God merciful, is a God who is, in his nature and being, merciful. So let me leave you with some final brief points that are tied to what we've seen thus far. Indeed, God has displayed and demonstrated his infinite mercy towards each and every one of us. He has done so generally. He has done so specifically. In the general sense, he has done so through the provision of everything that we have and know and love. And this overlaps naturally with his grace, grace being given that which you do not deserve. But naturally, the fact that every single one of us are sitting here, upright and breathing, is the adequate demonstration of his mercy. Everything you have, everything you know, everything you love, everything you hold dear, you do not deserve. None of you. Your punishment should have, would have, could have been death. It deserved to be death. The demands of justice deserved to befall your heads. Is it because you're uniquely bad? No. It's in fact because you're not uniquely bad. It's because you're just as bad as everyone else. It's because you too had violated the law of God. It is because you too had sinned against the very God who gave you life and breath. But yet here you are. Very reminiscent of the exchange that we see hearkening all the way back to the early chapters of Genesis, is it not? To you I give one commandment: do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you do, you shall surely die. Yet you keep reading, all but about a chapter and a half later, and lo and behold, they're somehow not very dead. This is the great and abounding chesed, emet, the great mercy of God. And again, therein, not only did they not physically die there and then, although they now would, not only were they subjected to spiritual death if it weren't for God, indeed, a promise of redemption was given to them. That is the grace. That is next week. It is useful, even as Christians, even as those who are born again, even as those who have been baptized into the faith, even as those who have been introduced and brought into the covenant people of God, even as those who have been justified, who are being sanctified, who will one day be glorified, it is most useful to pause, to reflect, to remind ourselves of the infinite mercy that we have been shown, of the fact that everything you have should have ended long ago. Because indeed, God does not desire sacrifices and rituals Does he take pleasure in your partaking in the assembly, in the ecclesia of God's people? Yes. Does he indeed love and adore the sweet incense of our prayers? Yes. Does he love our singing of praises unto him in or out of key? Yes. But think not that that is what ultimately pleases him. For indeed it is the same God who says that I do not desire sacrifices and rituals, but what? A humble and contrite heart. A heart that recognizes its standing before the infinite, divine, and holy God. So he has demonstrated his mercy in the general sense to us by not having executed his justice upon us, by not having poured out his wrath upon our head. He has then done so specifically, indeed, by not unleashing this onto us on account of our actions. This, by the way, might I point out, goes even for bad things occurring to us. We had a passage read to us earlier from Psalm 86, wherein this specific axiom, right, God the merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, was quoted, right, in Psalm 86. Let me read to you briefly just the context of what that was, because that hearkens to the very point I'm trying to draw here. In Psalm 86, verses 14 through 16a, we read the following. O God, insolent, translate that as arrogant men have risen up against me. A band of ruthless men seeks my life, and they do not set you before them. But you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Interesting. Consider the dynamic of what's going on there. He's talking, here the psalmist, about enemies assailing against him. It's a war context, as many of the psalms are. It's a battlefield context. Many enemies that are conspiring together to take me out. But thank you, God, that you're merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Interesting. Notice it's not in the context of you, O God, could have, should have, would have poured out your divine wrath and justice against me, a sinner, but you're gracious and merciful, etc., etc. Notice it's in the context of other human beings assailing to do evil, bad, wickedness against the psalmist. But you are gracious and merciful. How does that tie in? Because even in the context of bad and or explicitly evil things occurring against us, the withholding of that is an act of mercy on God's part. Do you see how that works? I take it, maybe I'm wrong, that no one got into a car crash on the way over here. Did anyone? No? Well, that's good. That's an act of mercy. Every single one of you are here, happy or not, smiling or not, coming with whatever happened to you during this week, and praise God that you're here nonetheless. An act of mercy. Haven't had anything go catastrophically, life-alteringly wrong this week? Act of mercy. Does this not enlighten for us, even at least on an elementary level, the story of Job, who I can promise you had a lot rougher of a life than anybody sitting in here, who had calamity after calamity after calamity, disaster after disaster after disaster befall him. And not only befall him, but befall him by the specific design of the evil one, acting with the express permission, as he always has to, of God himself. his family annihilated, his lands destroyed and stolen, all his livestock and resources and assets obliterated. Everything that could have gone wrong for Job did go wrong, including acts of overt and explicit evil. Yet what is the seminal and defining point, among many of course, but foundationally, of that piece of wisdom literature? It's the second that Job decides to start back-chatting that great terror comes from the heavens. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I raised the mountain peaks to their heights and the valley floors to their depths? Where were you when I created the great dragon Leviathan? Where were you? Where were you? Where were you? Where were you when I set the sun in its course and the moon in its path? Where were you when I created the infinite list of stars in the heavens? So it seems. Where were you when I put the heavenly bodies in their course and designed the very fabric of the giant planet upon which you reside? Where were you? Where were you? Where were you? This humbled Job, did it not? Right. Because even all the evil, bad things which occurred to Job, the great calamities and disasters, were not even the totality of what deserves to befall rebellious, sinful, wicked people. That's a tough pill to swallow, is it not? But yet, what happened to Job? He repented. He bowed down to God. He praised God. He rightfully acknowledged and worshipped God and was restored. And not only were his things restored, they were restored into manifoldly greater degree than anything that he had had before. God has demonstrated his great mercy to us each and every day in what has not befallen us. Yet also on the flip side of that, the great joy that we as Christians have is the fact that when we sin against God, which we do each and every day, as the great hymn says, morning by morning, new mercies I see. Right? All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy chesed, and really the emeth, the faithfulness, Lord, unto me. The beauties of God's mercies are renewed each and every morning. When we stumble, when we fall, when we sin, when we are broken over our sin, when we find ourselves in that same familiar pit of how on earth could God have possibly forgiven me, how on earth could God possibly love me, how on earth could God possibly keep me going, we are promised by this same God, I am Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and I am abounding in steadfast love, in mercy, in goodness, in faithfulness, in truth. And that doesn't get destroyed by your sin, because where sin abounds, grace abounds more. Not that we are to abuse it, as the Apostle Paul admonishes and warns us against, but indeed we are to rest most assuredly and comfortably upon that promise of God, that his grace and his mercy is far more powerful than any sin that we commit. And indeed, and I say this nicely, it is an insult to think that your sin can somehow overpower the mercy and grace of God. So take comfort in that. Indeed, this is the Christian joy. To leave you with this passage that was read to us earlier from Luke 18, this is arguably, no more simply and tersely encapsulated than in the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector in the temple. Jesus gives this parable of one day in the temple there being a Pharisee, right, a highly educated, famous, popular, influential, rabbinical teacher who is there for all to see in and amongst the crowd at the temple, busy as it was, saying, "Oh Lord, thank God," literally, "for not making me like these foolish, wicked peasants. Oh, thank you for making me so righteous. I mean, see all the great works that I've done. I mean, I tithe, I give to the poor, I pray so faithfully. I mean, after all, I'm a Pharisee. After all, a great rabbi of the synagogue. Oh, how great I am." Maybe he was singing kind of the first version of "How Great Thou Art," except it was just exchanged with "How Great I Am." This great demonstration of piety and of holiness and of virtue, and not in isolation, piety and holiness and virtue, which everyone else would have agreed with. Everyone else around him would have looked to him, "Oh, yes, teacher, yes, holy, yes, very pious, yes." I mean, look at them. You see them always, they're teaching the law and teaching the ways of Moses, and I mean, look, they're so immaculately dressed, and after all, I mean, they don't spend time, they're not caught in the company of those filthy prostitutes or tax collectors. You'll never find them in the red light district. No, they're always so pious. I mean, after all, we see them every day out by the city gate praying. Oh, the great prayers that they say for the people of Israel. Oh, how pious. This is what's called, to use modern parlance, virtue signalling. Virtue signalling, whereby you proclaim to the world how virtuous you are. It's the favourite pastime of the modern 21st century Westerner. Oh, how virtuous I am. Oh, look at the great works that I do. Look at all the wonderful views that I hold. Oh, I take my paper plastic bag so that I can save the world. Oh, I wear my mask to protect everyone else from this horrid disease. Oh, look at the rainbow flag that I fly in support of those gay people that I wouldn't be caught dead hanging out with. Oh, how virtuous. I mean, after all, look at my profile picture on Facebook. Don't you see that I support whatever the latest cause is that the talking feds on television taught me to support? Oh, how virtuous I am. I attend church regularly. Oh, how close to God I must be. I mean, he's the minister. I mean, he went to theological college. Oh, he has a PhD in theology. Wow, he must have done so much study. Oh, he must know so much about the scriptures. Oh, it's incredible. I mean, look, I contribute to the prayer meeting. Oh, I study my Bible all the time. I sing praises, lovely songs. I do really nice work. I mean, I give money to charity. That hits a bit closer at home, doesn't it? Juxtaposed to this great and holy and ever so virtuous figure is one who is described as being off in the distance or away from the crowd. You could also conceptualize that as off to the side, in other words, not in and amongst the kind of group of people of which the Pharisee is seemingly the centre point in this particular parable. Off to the side we have this dirty, filthy tax collector, this thief, this man who is robbing the people of Israel blind and giving it to their captors, to their hegemon, this beast, the Roman Empire. This man universally despised and hated. And without being smart, for reasonably good reasons. For fairly good reasons here. Right? For his, in the eyes of the people, selling his proverbial soul to work for the powerful empire. And here he stands over to the side and he cannot even raise his eyes towards the heavens, which I can guarantee you the Pharisee would have. And we're told that he's beating his chest. This may be easier for the men to understand than the women. To have a man rendered into this particular position takes a lot. Okay? This is a demonstration of severe passion, sincere passion, a great anguish in his soul, an incredible burden that renders him, even in a public place, not a comfortable area for emotional demonstration on the part of most men, which is how we're built, and yet he's off to the side, yet still in public view, weeping, beating his chest with great passion, incredible emotion. And all he says, all that we're given, is this very terse, laconic statement. God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. He's begging from a place of deep, heartfelt contrition. Sacrifices and rituals I desire not, Pharisee, but a humble and contrite heart, repentant tax collector. Who does Jesus tell us went home justified? The great and virtuous and pious Pharisee? Not at all. He, like almost all the rest of them, went home ever so justified in their own mind, and went the rest of their life ever so justified in their own mind, right until they took that first step through the gates of hell. The tax collector, the one who had indeed sinned, but who, with a humble and contrite heart in the face of Almighty God, flung himself upon the only possible hope that exists in this world, the great mercy of God. God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. And it is the incarnate God who tells us that that man went home justified, not this self-righteous insert expletive. That's who went home justified. Thus must be the posture of all those who would be justified before God. Take joy and take comfort, Christian, for indeed it is in our position of humility and contrition when we realise and see and understand that there is no hope in ourselves, nor any hope in men that can be found, but rather only hope in Yahweh, merciful and gracious, who is slow to anger and who is abounding, who is exceeding in steadfast love, in faithfulness, in goodness, in truth, and in mercy. Amen.